Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Sharon, NHIA's Chief Operating Officer and your moderator for today's fourth education session in NHIA's summer series, Overcoming Barriers to Adding Specialty to Your Home Infusion Model, generously sponsored by NHIA Silver member, Accelera RX. Accelera RX is an integrated health system access, insight, and performance optimization company that connects manufacturers, health systems, and payers through integrated programs that optimize the quality and cost of complex pharmacy patient care. They are a trusted partner who delivers seamless access to a nationwide network of accredited health systems, the industry's most comprehensive complex patient data platform, a health system-centric pharmacy benefit management solution, and fully integrated pharmacy care program. Through these intentional connected offerings, we enable healthcare systems and payers to improve the quality of care and patient outcomes while empowering manufacturers to improve performance at every stage of the product lifecycle. At Accelera, they are passionate about transforming the way integrated care is delivered in healthcare systems and creating an environment where manufacturers, health systems, and payers and patients all win. We truly appreciate Accelera's RX support of our industry and this webinar. The summer series is focused on providing you with free education in CE that you would have enjoyed at our annual conference in April. Make sure to watch Infusion Express for upcoming sessions and the registration links for NHIA's new website. Click on Learn CE Summer Series to register for future events or catch up on education you missed. In honor of the upcoming holiday, our next webinar in the summer series will be on July 8th. Wow, time is flying by. I can't believe we're getting close to July 4th holiday. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. The presentation and speaker bio is available for download in the handout section of the navigation panel. The webinar is recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you following the conclusion of the webinar and will also be available via NHIA's website within the next 24 hours. In order to receive CE, please follow the link in the follow-up email and complete a short quiz. Following the presentation, we will have time to answer your questions. Please submit your questions via the question tab in the navigation pane at any time. Okay, now on to our presentation. Jonathan, founder and CEO of STAC, is going to walk us through solutions to common barriers associated with adding specialty to your home infusion business. I know Jonathan has a lot of great information to present, so let's get started.
This is great, and thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to everybody for the opportunity to be speaking with you today. You know, it's a shame that I'm doing it from my home office in my basement as opposed to the Gaylord out in Denver, but nonetheless, we're going to pursue on. I'd like to take this as an opportunity to introduce myself just briefly. As Jen mentioned, my name is Jonathan Borchak. I'm the founder and CEO of STAC, a compliance management software for pharmacies, whether they're home infusion specialty alike. There's a lot of complexities behind them, and we've built some solutions to help to mitigate and manage everything that happens outside of the dispense for you and your patients. I've been focused in the specialty industry for a majority of my career. Grew up in a big corporate specialty pharmacy, moved to smaller independent, and now serve in a number of educational and consulting type roles. As things have progressed over the years. And there's plenty to learn and plenty to understand as it relates to specialty pharmacy as an industry. And that's what we're looking to talk about a little bit today. As a participant in this session, a couple of things we want to make sure that you walk out of here with an understanding of. Number one is having a better definition of what specialty really is. Where did it come from? Why is it here? Why is it a good fit within the home infusion industry, as well as just the overall continuum of care for our patients. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the functional areas, different areas related to that specialty experience, not only from the patient perspective, but ultimately from you as a caregiver, as a pharmacy provider. What are some of the things that might be looked for to better position you to become a stronger participant in the specialty space? And then talk about some of those limitations, because let's face it, there's going to be limitations no matter where you go and looking to diversify your business. What are some of those things that you might see as it relates to specialty in particular that might become barriers that we can look to overcome? So first and foremost, the question that I get all the time as it relates to specialty, what is specialty pharmacy? What's the definition of that? And what products are really considered a part of the specialty industry? Well, I wish that I had that silver bullet, that magic answer that said, okay, this is what specialty is. Unfortunately, it's such a gray area. And a large part of that is because it does touch a number of different avenues across the industry. And so because of that gray area, because of that little bit of uncertainty, it really is a variable sort of definition. So I'm going to try to put some scope around that and give you a little bit of a better understanding of what that looks like. The definition of specialty varies from manufacturer of drug to manufacturer of drug. I mean, if I was a manufacturer, I would consider my product to be special, and there's a reason why people should be using it. There's a reason why patients should be, prescribed my therapy. So what are some things that you can look at just to say, other than, it's my product, it's special to me, that makes it important? Similarly, that definition varies from payer to payer. And I'm sure that you guys see this all the time as it comes to not only a contracting perspective, but just from a formulary perspective too. There are certain tangible things that payers may look at when it comes to a better understanding of how the definition of specialty might be defined. For general rules and general speaking kind of terms here, the general definition fits one or more of these criteria. And again, I say one or more because this isn't a mutually inclusive list. Is the drug a chronic type of condition? Is it something that you need to be treating it on the whole, month after month after month? One can argue you do the same thing with your diabetic patients. You do the same thing with your TPN patients potentially. So why does that make it special? Even nowadays with some of the costlier cell and gene therapies that might be a one-time curative sort of thing, chronic may not necessarily be that one defining sort of moment for our patients. Is it initiated by a specialist? And this tends to be a little bit more of a defining sort of factor. You don't tend to see specialty therapies prescribed by a primary care physician. Oftentimes they're referred out. You go to a gastroenterologist, a rheumatologist, an oncologist to land on a diagnosis and then land on the path of treatment thereafter. And a lot of times that specialist initiation is where things get started from that pathway to move forward for defining what a specialty drug might be. A lot of times, and when I teach these types of classes at the PharmD level, I'm in with student pharmacists, and I say, well, what is a specialty drug? I'd say 9 times out of 10, the first person raises their hand and say, well, it's expensive. And I can't say that it's wrong. The general guidance and the general definition that $670 a month is what's most recently been published as guidance from CMS. But if you look at it on the scale of annualizing that, you're looking at a little over $8,000 a month. There are some drugs in the community sector that could be that costly. By and large, though, some specialty drugs may be well beyond that. You might be looking into tens of thousands of dollars per year, hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. Cost does become a consideration, and a lot of times the management of that cost is where the value of you as a pharmacy provider can get engaged to help to offset that financial burden for patients. We're going to talk a little bit more about restricted distribution here in a minute as far as limited distribution networks and the like. But there's these other sorts of areas that can help to define a specialty drug. Is there a REMS program involved? Maybe, maybe not. Are the products injectable? Either they need to rely on a provider like yours that could provide the home infusion type solution, or is it something where there needs to be training for a patient, a caregiver, to be able to administer, subcutaneous type of therapy? That little bit of extra handling or hands-on approach tends to help better define what drug might be a specialty type of drug. I do some consulting work for the National Association of Specialty Pharmacies, and they actually put out a definition several years ago as specialty was really getting some press, and not necessarily good press in the marketplace. We wanted to help to better define what specialty truly was, and it meets a lot of the same criteria of what you might be seeing from a home infusion perspective. State licensed, accredited, focusing on health conditions with complex therapies, and dealing with things like medication use, adherence, interaction with the patient, more frequent than what you might see in the community setting. Really, the ultimate goal is a specialty pharmacy to help. It really helps to engage to improve appropriate medication use for these more complex sorts of disease states. And this isn't a wholly inclusive list here either, but it does tend to give you a portrait of some of the therapies that might be considered specialty as far as populations are concerned. A lot of those that are viewed on the left there are the more common sorts of therapies, things that you might see that have some crossover as far as dispensing in the community or in a specialty pharmacy. A lot of times that might be a payer-driven type of approach to define where does that go. But for therapies like hepatitis C, a short-term course of therapy tends to be curative, but it comes at a higher price point due to the curative nature of it. The therapies on the right-hand side, those tend to be a little bit more mutually inclusive to that specialty type of designation because there are smaller populations associated with it. Patients receiving IVIG, there are far fewer of those than there are patients that are receiving therapies for HIV and AIDS. These rare and orphan disease populations where you might be looking at populations of less than 200,000 lives in the US, that's automatically going to kind of predicated towards moving towards a specialty type of population. But if you'll note, a lot of the therapies here, a lot of the things that you're looking at, these populations do overlap from time to time with what you might see in a traditional home infusion type of setting. They might be patients that you're working with already. Looking at infused Remicade patients or things like that. I mean, there's a number of areas of overlap that might exist between the home infusion sector and what's viewed under a traditional specialty pharmacy type business. Now, when you're looking at areas for differentiation, I'm going to go into each one of these, but each one of these areas tends to be something that is looked for during that process when a pharmacy is applying for a request for proposal, or they're looking to become a part of a payer restricted network or a pharma manufacturer restricted network. Each one of these areas can serve as one of those benchmarkers, and it really helps to align or showcase where capabilities might be for a pharmacy as it relates to that. So we're going to dig into each one of these over the next couple of minutes, just to provide some insight as far as what might be looked for from the pharma or the payer side that can better help you to align. Does diving more into a specialty infused type of population make the most sense for me? So let's first talk about accreditation. And for those of you that are involved in home infusion, I'm sure some of you live and breathe this every day. There's a number of reasons for third-party accreditors to get involved to ensure quality and continuity of care for patients. But at the same time, that's now become really a benchmark, a standard, a requirement for the delivery of specialty pharmacy care, where that may not have been the case a decade or so ago. So let's talk about a few of those programs and how they look to align. First and foremost is through a group called URAC. And URAC, which tends to be recognized as the gold standard for specialty pharmacies. Well, why is it the gold standard? Oftentimes, it's a requirement. It shows up on a payer contract. It shows up as a part of a pharma-facing RFP. Are you accredited by URAC? It's a checkbox that's pre-printed on that form. As you can see there, these are numbers that are accurate as of this morning. I wanted to make sure that we were presenting things that made most sense accuracy-wise. But there's about 472 pharmacies that have a specialty pharmacy accreditation from URAC. And you'll see that that's grown by well over 100 since this time last year. Now, URAC looks at a number of different programs. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the home infusion, the mail order types of programs, the community-based and specialty. Obviously, they recently became deeming authority through Medicare for a HIT-based program, which might be something that's along the lines of what you might be looking for to help to differentiate your current businesses. But the URAC approach, it focuses on several key measures. Now, there's some mandatory measures that you need to be able to report on and demonstrate. And so they rely on things like call center performance. When you're engaging with those patients, how long do they have to wait on hold? What is the average speed for you to answer the phone? How long and how frequently are you engaging with those patients? You need to be able to provide some details because those are measured. They want to benchmark your performance against an industry standard to ensure that patients working with you are receiving a certain caliber of care. The same thing happens as it relates to dispensing accuracy and distribution accuracy. Are you getting the right drug to the right patient? Are you getting it as far as a delivery promise is concerned? Like, is the package showing up on the right day to dispense the product to them? What's going on as far as turnaround time? They're trying to put some parameters around, how long does it take for a specialty drug to be fulfilled once it's prescribed by a prescriber? And then this most recent one for mandatory measures is for patients or pharmacies that actually work within the hepatitis C disease category, how many of those patients are successfully completing their course of therapy. So this is a mandatory measure for those types of pharmacies. There also are some exploratory measures too. There's 7 of those right now, and they're looking to put some parameters and some quality measures around what goes on within the pharmacy. How are you measuring drug-drug interactions, and how, as a third-party pharmacy provider, are you able to circumvent any issues that might arise? we likely see this all the time from the home infusion perspective. You're looking to navigate what's going on with home meds, if you will, from a patient, things that might be filled in their community settings or chronic therapies, and engage from a holistic sort of perspective for how to manage those patients. You're looking for ways to measure that and improve that you're completing reconciliation as applicable. There's things related to adherence. There's things related to different proportion of days covered as far as actually appropriate utilization, so you're not overfilling or underfilling patients. Outside of some measures that have just come out related to adherence for specific therapies themselves, for things like RNMS. Really, it's looking at this overall experience. It's trying to find ways to understand what is the experience of a specialty patient whenever they are working with an accredited pharmacy. They want to help to raise that bar for all of those participants. Next is a program through the Accreditation Council for Healthcare, which is ACHC. They do have CMS deeming authority, and you can gain that through a specialty pharmacy accreditation if you provide DemiPost services as well. They also have home infusion deeming programs that are available as well. And so you'll see here that there's a little bit of a different approach from how they recognize locations. ACHC looks at number of locations, whereas on the URAC side of things, they look at organizations. It's really up to them as far as how they look to recognize or accredit. So you'll see there's a number of locations that are accredited by ACHC as specialty providers. And it's really looking at the structure of the organization related to how those services are being afforded to patients. That's really their thought process and their modality behind it. And you're looking at a number of different key standard areas. How does the organization built? What's the structure? And a lot of these standards and areas do crosswalk or cross-reference between their home infusion programs, their infusion programs, and their specialty programs. So if you become accredited with one program, there's a lot of crosswalk and a lot of overlap to become more engaged as a home infusion provider. A lot of these are, again, more organizationally focused. Things like human resources. They're looking at personnel files to make sure that employees are being trained and onboarded appropriately. You're looking to make sure that testing is completed for any instances where there might be a home infusion type of therapy that is dispensed. So something you guys are very familiar with. Looking at infection controls, safety. What's the performance improvement process? How are we looking to continually make our organization better? That's really where there's some similarities between the URAC program with ACHC, but there also are enough differences that it can warrant there being a payer-based requirement to check the box to say, all right, well, we need one versus the other, we need two, et cetera. One of the newer programs that is available is through a group called CPPA. It's a joint ventured sort of program between APHA, ASHP, and NABP. Those programs are now kind of breaking off into their own respective areas, but there is a community program, a telemed program, and a specialty program. So the specialty program is continuing to grow, and it's a little bit more clinically focused than the prior two programs that I mentioned. From the perspective of CPPA, they're looking to gather specifics as far as disease management and more clinical delivery focus and outcomes sort of focus, whereas the first two are looking to be more prescriptive to say, okay, this is your policy, your procedure for how you're managing these patients clinically. Prove that you're doing that. So it gives you the ability to have some more insight or more visibility and actually start to benchmark the capabilities of these providers from that perspective. Just trying to round it out as far as other programs are concerned, you have groups like the program formerly known as VIPS through NABP, which is now recently renamed to be the NABP Accredited Digital Pharmacy Program. It's really focused at any online sort of presence that your pharmacy might have within the web space. You'll see there's about 74 locations nationwide, and really it's geared towards safe prescribing of prescriptions. It's giving you the ability to validate that as you receive a prescription and you're doing any sort of business online, that it's not, it is pursuant to a patient's prescription from a prescriber. It's not something that's being done in a kind of ill-formed sort of fashion. Similarly, we have programs like VOD, which was formerly known as VOD. It's now known as the Drug Distributor Program through NABP. It's really focused on the ability to wholesale. State by state, there are certain regulations that might be in place as far as the percentage of drugs that are dispensed direct to patient versus direct to health system. And in certain cases, in the specialty sector in particular, there may be a benefit to working with a specialty pharmacy to you drop ship drug to a center of excellence or things to that effect. So more and more states are recognizing this program as a benchmark, and it becomes more of a gold standard across that drug delivery system. And so you're seeing more and more pharmacies that have those capabilities or have that need in more orphan or small populations to provide direct to health system types of services to be able to administer the drug. Everybody loves the Joint Commission, don't get me wrong. There's no true specialty pharmacy certification though right now through the Joint Commission. It does tend to rely on the home health types of programs, but there are certain standards that kind of crosswalk between the home care program and what's being needed for the specialty sector. Really, as those of you that have Joint Commission accreditation are aware, it's really focused on the overall care of that patient, the outcomes. This program in particular, there does stand to be a lot of crossover between what's expected in the home infusion space, as well as what's expected from the specialty care delivery model. And then also the compliance team, again, another deeming authority through CMS, but they do have a specialty pharmacy focused program, even though historically they've been focused more on the long-term care and the demi-post space for delivery. So lots of opportunities and lots of options that are out there to meet the needs of what's expected from providers to measure that level and caliber of quality that an accreditation can provide. Now, again, looking to mirror this as far as what the expectation tends to be from a specialty provider's perspective. If you're looking at going through the process of applying for limited drug distribution or applying for a limited specialty network to be able to be reimbursed through a third-party payer, the standard might be one accreditation. You need to be a specialty accredited provider. You might need to demonstrate 2 accreditations. We've even seen some things where certain payers are requiring that you have certifications for your pharmacist. Are you an HIV certified? Do you have an HIV certified pharmacist on staff? Do you have a certified specialty pharmacist on staff? So, the accreditation and the benchmarking does become a standard and does become potentially an entry point where your pharmacy can get engaged and start to provide additional specialty services. Now, technology is another key focus here, and it's another key part where the specialty experience tends to really take root. And there's a number of different ways that technology can be involved. Obviously, you need to be able to adjudicate claims to make sure that patients are able to be appropriately, you as a pharmacy are able to be appropriately reimbursed, but the patients themselves is able to hit against their benefits that they're paying in through either through a federal program or their employer. Technology can also help to drive the management of referrals. Specialty drugs are very complex from a referral perspective, and oftentimes just an e-prescription may not capture all that's needed. If it's a weight-based therapy, if there's additional programs or services or ancillary meds that need to be dispensed as part of an order set, you're not going to necessarily see that through a direct e-prescription referral. And so a lot of technologies are really suited to help to receive the entirety of that prescription order and the supporting clinical documentation that can be utilized to support a prior auth or an appeal. In the technology sector as well, you need to be able to demonstrate how you're managing the care of that patient outside of just the adjudication of the claim. And most specialty systems will have some type of way to build in care programs to show that patients are being managed longitudinally across their entire patient journey and not just for the transactional piece of dispensing the drug. A lot of those requirements from a care program perspective are dictated from the accreditors or the payers themselves. Data becomes a huge sort of thing as it relates to specialty populations, particularly aggregating the data, learning more about those patients, how those patients are engaged. When you're looking at it from that perspective, specialty patients tend to make up such a small fraction of the overall clinical trial landscape. Once a drug might be approved and it's available and it's out there in the wild, you can learn so much more about how that drug is used if you can gather some meaningful and purposeful sort of data. So the more that you're able to learn, extract, capture about those patients, if you could do it in a streamlined technology-facing way, it really helps to benefit you. It also helps you to interact and engage with other providers. Are you able to interact with a third-party manufacturer-sponsored hub? Are you able to interact with a data aggregation arm that's hired by a manufacturer? There's a lot of opportunities to be able to connect in from a provider perspective to learn more about your patients and provide more information back out about your patients. Let's talk a little bit about reporting too. And we talked about this data piece of things. The data does become critical as far as managing specialty lives. You can learn obviously about what goes on with prescribers and their habits. And you see a lot of these types of efforts, even in the community sector, as far as what goes on with the need to capture and act upon data. But also you can start to see, are these diseases that we're looking to treat, because they are smaller in population, what types of patterns do we see? Are there these patients being identified, and maybe there's some type of regional distribution of how these lives are being diagnosed? Is it something that we can work our way back up the process and determine more about etiology and presentation of disease just by identifying these sorts of patterns? And ultimately, from an additional pattern perspective, what happens from the health plan perspective? What does a benefit structure look like? What do formularies look like? If you have a better sense of how those patients are being managed, even from the specialty pharmacy's perspective, you can make more meaningful recommendations back to prescribers. You can make more meaningful recommendations within your relationships with limited distribution networks, with drug companies as well, because you have a better sense of what the actual blocking and tackling is that's going on to get those patients started on therapy. Most importantly, though, and you're seeing this big shift in the healthcare industry as a whole, is looking at outcomes management. What happens when you start this patient on a drug? What types of interventions do you get involved with? What types of side effects might patients be identifying? How well are these drugs working? The more that you can understand about what's going on once the patient ingests the drug, then you can actually look to custom tailor that response and make it much more meaningful for those patients on the whole. Contractually, you might need to provide some data too. On a quarterly basis, you need to show that you're meeting some of those metrics. The accreditors are looking for some of that data in order to remain accredited. Payers are oftentimes looking for things during a quarterly business review through key performance indicators to show that you're doing well. Ultimately, the data piece really comes into play to understand how some of these specialty populations really come into fit here. And this diagram is actually to scale. I will tell you, I sat and I counted all the little pixels here just to make it to scale, to demonstrate like what the size and scope of some of these drug populations looks like. I mean, that blue square, 102 million patients, those are the number of patients that were treated with some type of drug for hyperlipidemia last year in the United States. A smaller segment of that population are those patients that were treated with some type of therapy for RA. So only 1.5 million patients. It's substantially smaller than the number of patients that are being treated for some of these larger chronic conditions. Outside of that, you then see an orphan drug designation for a diagnosis that was recently approved for spinal muscular atrophy. There's only 10,000 patients in the US being treated with one of those therapies. That's orders of magnitude smaller than what you see for patients that are being diagnosed with hyperlipidemia. Those orders of magnitude also lend itself to certain things, orphan drug designated products. You don't have to go through as much from a clinical trials perspective. You might be able to get a drug approved after a phase 2 trial, but you need to know still more about what's going on with those patients once more patients are using the drug. The more that you can understand, the more that you know, the more that you can more actionably decide what's going on with these patients, the better. And so that really becomes the power of data. That one little square versus all of those little squares combined, you can learn more and actually help to better improve the outcomes in that patient experience if you're able to capture some better data about them. So let's talk then about this restricted distribution component of things. Whether you call it restricted distribution, narrow networks, there's a component of inventory control. It all comes into play. Oftentimes you'll see this conversation around limited distribution networks, or LDD therapies, as it relates to specialty drugs. That availability is really driven by the setup of a drug network and how the manufacturer looks to release that product into the supply chain. They may look to limit the distribution of a drug just to better maintain what that patient experience looks like once they've begun to utilize one of these products. Not only that, it helps to better manage the cost overall within the system. If you have a handful of pharmacies that are able to understand the nuance, the complexity of getting the drugs approved and doing it appropriately, as opposed to it being a one-off sort of experience with a patient walking through a community pharmacy type of location, it really helps to manage the cost and the overall experience for the patient on the whole. Oftentimes these distribution networks are managed contractually. It's a one-to-one relationship between a pharmacy and a drug manufacturer, or many pharmacy to one, just depending on the scope of the network. But managing it contractually really helps to meet some of those touch points. It's making sure those accreditations are in place. It's making sure that you have the technology available to capture data then for the patients and hand that back in some type of usable format. So that way, not only the manufacturer can learn more about the drug, the patient experience, but then that's data that can be used by the FDA to have a better understanding of what goes on with these drugs post-commercialization. Now, when you look at it from a strategy perspective, just taking a step back, any type of pharmacy aside, open channel distributed products are those that, as long as you have a license from a board of pharmacy, as long as you have an NPI number, you can set up a relationship with a wholesaler and go out and buy a drug. You can dispense it pursuant to a patient prescription. Those types of drugs are determined by each manufacturer of the product that said, well, this is how we want to bring it into the channel. Some decisions might be made to limit that distribution. So instead of it being made available, the most recent number I saw, about 86,000 pharmacies of all kinds nationwide. Rather than have this drug available to 86,000 pharmacies, let's limit the scope. Let's put a contract in place where you're only able to buy this through a specialty distributor. And so it's immediately narrowing the types of pharmacies that can buy the drug. Let's have a one-to-one type of relationship to make sure that you're only buying the drug from us at the manufacturer. We're cutting the middleman out of the wholesaler. But in exchange for getting access to buy the drug, you're giving us information. We're helping to better control that patient experience, the types of questions that are being asked on a monthly basis, the Q&A that goes back and forth, the clinical programs, the support services, all of the limitations that come with the limited purchasing really help to benefit the patient experience on the whole and ensure that whether it's Jonathan's pharmacy or Jen's pharmacy that look to dispense that drug year after year, as the benefit structures for the patients might change, their experience with the drug, the diagnosis, and the disease state can remain consistent. Now, in certain populations, it may make sense to not have multiple partners involved. If the patient populations are so small that it just dilutes that experience, manufacturers may choose to have a drug that's dispensed exclusively. Why muddy the waters and have variability in delivery? If you can better control the experience by only having one provider in a network, then that could be a viable solution for a manufacturer that are looking to commercialize their product. That was a pretty meaningless animation there. The payer networks look to work the same way. And this is something from a specialty versus home infusion versus outside type of model that you can see. So as opposed to inventory restriction, you might start to see that there are restrictions as it comes to payer networks as well. Every investment, every time that a patient is being dispensed drug to them, whether through a home infusion model, specialty model, the community model, et cetera, that's an investment on behalf of that health plan or that payer in that individual patient. And so the ability to contract with you as a provider really helps to put some restrictions on all of these areas. Same sort of thing that we've talked about with all of these different areas from the manufacturer perspective, but it helps to manage reimbursement, helps to control margins. It helps to ensure that the patients that are being dispensed are actually receiving the benefit of having that drug dispensed to them. And so if you're able to narrow those networks from a payer perspective, and only certain pharmacies have access to manage patient lives from a reimbursement perspective, it helps to control that overall experience from the payer's perspective. So oftentimes these things work hand in hand, the pharmaceutical manufacturer distribution piece, the payer reimbursement piece of things, and ultimately, how do those things look to marry together? Are there certain drugs where a payer looks to manage it and say, well, yes, it may have been managed in a home infusion setting traditionally, but now we're looking to control that drug spend as a specialty product. So we're expecting, different things of you to be able to maintain your books of business. Those are stories that I hear all the time from home infusion pharmacies as they're looking to kind of crosswalk programs, differentiate sorts of services and standards just to make sure that that patient experience remains through the patients that they've already established and built. Inventory control wise, this is always an interesting piece of things too. So from the manufacturer's perspective, particularly in these narrower populations, you don't have to manufacture as much, or you maybe don't need to manufacture as often, but you still run into issues as it relates to the overall supply chain of that product. Maybe you have a particular shelf life that drug can exist for. How do you manage manufacturing of that product with actual utilization out in the world that's more patient-facing? So controlling that manufacturing, having a better sense of forecasting and predictive utilization as far as what drug is going to be utilized, as far as when we need to go and manufacture more, it becomes critical for the overall understanding of what's going on, not just through direct to patient utilization, but how do we best predict when we start to make another lot of drug? How do we know when we need to, does it make sense to reduce costs and do a direct purchasing type of agreement to cut that middleman out from a wholesaler perspective? Or are there more and more patients and more and more partners that we need to get engaged, so it makes more sense for us to engage a wholesaler? It goes hand in hand with all of those experiences. Oftentimes too, it becomes a management or a maintenance program for that patient's experience. You don't want to run into issues where there's not enough drug available and now the drug goes on shortage and the patient is the one that has to suffer as a result of that. The more that you're able to predict or understand inventory control from not only a manufacturer's perspective, but the pharmacy's perspective, it really helps to benefit the patients in that way. There are no shortages. There are no instances where you might be running into considerations or concerns from a utilization perspective. So looking at it from that perspective, and just to kind of summarize as it relates to the home infusion experience, a lot of the things that we talked about, a lot of these key characteristics, and we'll come back to my little graphic here, they're already in place. The ability for you to control inventory, the ability for you to contract with payers or pharma companies, the ability to purchase the drug from a restricted distribution capability, reporting, data capture, patient engagement or patient experience, the accreditation piece of things, all of these areas, while they, we're framing the conversation today in the light of how it's being managed for specialty pharmacies. Well, there are a lot of capabilities that you as a home infusion provider already have in place. And it's just having the ability to understand, what are some of the expectations? What are some of the needs? What are some of the things that might be, I might be called upon to perform, to do as a provider that would not be the case necessarily if I weren't looking at just focusing on specialty therapy. There truly are a number of synergies that can occur between both of those modalities. And if you look at even some of the past history of where specialty pharmacy grew, a lot of it grew out of the need to provide home infusion products in the home. A lot of some of the legacy software products or those technologies that are built for pharmacies are built on home infusion based sorts of platforms. And so there are synergies there, and it's really just up to you as an individual provider to have a sense of what makes the most sense for me to deliver the care or deliver the appropriate services for patients to have an expanded scope or an expanded type of service available to them. Okay, so we're going to leave this time open for some question and answer. Jen, I'm going to hand it back to you to go through that.
Great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. This is such excellent information. We've got questions coming in already. So let me just start with our first question. What are the opportunities from a revenue profit perspective? Specialty tends to have low GP percentage. When you talked about limited distribution and the data and clinical outcomes, I'm curious if those services and data has an additional revenue opportunity. If not, does this mean we have to be so efficient that a high level of scale of patients to turn a profit? Well, that's a great question.
That's a great question, and I think that there's a couple of different things that we can tackle here as part of that the question itself. So let's start with the first part of that question. So let's talk about the scope and the revenue opportunities. Yes. So a lot of times when I've come in, I've consulted with pharmacies, and we have these sorts of conversations. The thought is, oh, well, I'm going to get a specialty accreditation. I'm going to be a specialty pharmacy and put these services in place, and the dollars are just going to come flowing through. And that's not necessarily the case. Just because you have the little accreditation seal on your website doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the business coming through there. There needs to be some sort of strategy to pull those patients through. So whether it's a physician or a prescriber facing strategy to identify yourself as that provider, that's one thing. For it to be an opportunity for you to position yourself to a payer to carve out some dollars or some lives to manage, or work with a manufacturer. The contracted sorts of lives that you tend to drive through tend to be the best way to focus on driving revenue or opportunity to build an appreciable specialty business. Now, depending on the type of reimbursement that you have, if you're familiar with home infusion reimbursement versus specialty reimbursement, it's not like, just because the costs associated with specialty products may be higher from an acquisition cost perspective, doesn't necessarily mean that the margin will be there necessarily as well. I mean, it tends to be a little bit of a lower margin. And there was also a report that was published several weeks ago, was looking at the cost to fill across different sites of care. And average cost to fill for a specialty type product is on average about $75 per fill. And so it's a higher cost model than what you might see in other avenues. And so you have to understand that the overhead tends to be a little bit higher. So where do those costs get absorbed? Where do some of those things happen? Ultimately, you're providing some additional support from a financial perspective. You're helping to navigate the benefits for a patient, to have an understanding of what is happening and where, why those patients are, what's happening from a formulary perspective to get the drug approved. What are some of the resources available once the drug is approved to offset their out-of-pocket, whether it's a copay card, whether it's financial assistance through a foundation, manufacturer-based programs, et cetera. So there's a labor model there that's above and beyond what you're used to seeing. The clinical model tends to be a little bit higher too. It's a higher touch model to engage with those patients on a monthly basis, not just to set up their next refill, but asking them some of those clinical questions, putting them in touch with the necessary clinicians to manage any side effects, manage any things that are there. So it is a little bit of a higher touch model. Now, I think I was trying to jot down all the points of that question as we went. I think the last part of that is, so are there opportunities for additional revenue streams? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Those structures for data, oftentimes, if you can find a relationship or find some contracted opportunities with a payer or with a manufacturer, they may look to reimburse you to pass that data back and forth, as long as it's something that's above and beyond what you already provide to them or provide on behalf of other patients throughout the scope of that service. If you're able to provide the service of doing an additional clinical assessment or providing some additional clinical checkpoints or a survey that's administered on behalf of the patient, and they can answer, it's helping to enhance or differentiate that patient experience of what their core pharmacy offering is versus an enhanced or above and beyond sort of opportunity. There are ways to monetize that and be reimbursed for that. Now, it can exist in one of two different ways. One, it could be a fee-for-service type of opportunity where, every time that a pharmacist speaks with a patient on an enhanced clinical opportunity, I could get paid, between X and Y as far as dollars are concerned. Another opportunity, and this is where some pharmacies tend to just see the benefit, is the ability for me to provide the service. I can get into a contracted network, and I can drive some revenue off of fills where I wouldn't have had access to those patients' lives if I didn't provide the service. And so, the dollars that are earned or the dollars that are won are coming from you just being able to dispense on behalf of those patients for providing those services. So, it does help to offset some of those costs by providing those above and beyond sorts of services, whether it's clinical counseling, if it's disease counseling or drug counseling. It could be service provided types of opportunities where you're providing in-home training or virtual training, and nowadays as it relates to that patient experience. If it's providing some additional technologies or modalities to follow up with patients, there's a number of different ways that you can structure these programs. And as long as you can demonstrate a meaningful need for them, you may be able to be reimbursed for provision of that type of care. Did I touch all those points, Jen? I think I got all of them from my scribble here.
That was great. I'm learning so much. All right, we have quite a few more questions, so let's keep going. If you're not currently accredited as a specialty provider, do you have to have that specialty accreditation in order to be successful?
So it would, I would say that it's probably dependent on your relationship with the individual payers as far as what those expectations might be. If you look at the standards across the specialty providers, there are a lot of core standards that transcend just the specialty program, and they can hit other areas of the pharmacy industry. So for instance, a lot of the core standards within the URAC specialty program are also recognized within their home infusion program. A lot of the core standards for ACHC are not only just in specialty, but you might see them in mail order, you might see them in home infusion. So a lot of the things that you might be doing as a home infusion pharmacy can check the box. They can meet the needs of what the expectation for provision of care into those different sites of care. Now, the difference might just be some of those little individual specific areas. And that's where I say it tends to be more payer specific. You might receive a contract from a third party payer and they say, well, in order for us to reimburse you for this drug, you need to demonstrate that you have a specialty accreditation in place. Sometimes that might just be a conversation with their credentialing team that you could say, well, I have a home infusion-based accreditation. Here's where a lot of the crosswalking occurs. Does this meet the need? And it can engage in some additional conversation there. Oftentimes, the accreditors themselves can be great advocates on your behalf, particularly if you already have one of their programs to say, okay, hey, payer X, these standards are meeting most of the boxes here. Why would you, look for any differences? And oftentimes they may be able to help you to crosswalk between programs if you truly require a specialty-facing program just to meet a contractual requirement. So having one accreditation or even a home health, home infusion-based accreditation is a great starting point, because you're probably doing most of the work that would be expected of you to move into more of a specialty-focused type of program.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Any insight into what manufacturers are looking for from a pharmacy size? So for instance, are they looking for the large big box pharmacies versus small regional pharmacies? Any insight into that?
Yeah, it really depends on the drug. It's become, if you look at the trend of how specialty has been managed over the last couple of decades, specialty as an industry really got its roots, its start in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a relatively young component of the industry, all things considered. Manufacturers and their responses to how they bring drugs into the channel have kind of gone up and down over a number of years. There was a great thought process maybe 10, 15 years ago that if I was going to commercialize a drug as a manufacturer, I only wanted to be in a big box type of organization, because there was a higher likelihood that my drug would receive better formulary positioning if my affiliate pharmacy had the ability to dispense that product. Now, right now we're in a phase where you're seeing more and more of a need for specialization or really niche type of care and delivery of care, as opposed to just saying it's a one-size-fits-all type of approach. Manufacturers are looking for more of those niche patient-facing types of approaches. So can you provide those services? Can you provide us that higher touch, that better patient experience, that truly specialized approach? And if you can, then we want to give you access to our product. Now, some of that might be done from a national perspective. A lot of times that is determined based on the patient population. I've seen some numbers out there that for every 10 to 15,000 patients that might be in a drug class, that might warrant adding another pharmacy into a network. So for super small populations, it might be really hard to get access to a drug. Other times, manufacturers might look at it from a payer perspective. Let's look at our patients' populations from a geographic perspective. There are patients, I'm based here in Pittsburgh. If I have a pharmacy that's contracted with our health plans that are more regionally focused in Pittsburgh, and that's where our patients reside, maybe we're more inclined to have a pharmacy participating in that light, because we'll know that there's a better relationship and the patients may be reimbursed more effectively or efficiently. You might see some manufacturers that look at building things geographically just along those same lines. Like let's move all of our patient lives to be somewhere that's proximal to those patients, because they have a better relationship with the payers, and it cuts down on transit time as we're looking to get the drugs to them. So there's a number of different ways that they approach it, and I would say that it's not as cookie cutter of an approach as it used to be, where hey, we're going to give it to big box PBM affiliated, health plan affiliated provider. There's a lot of different levers that manufacturers may look to pull to make that experience very specific for their unique drug that they're looking to commercialize.
Great, thank you. So in general, I know all states have a little bit different, obviously, regulatory, but in general, what type of license does a pharmacy have to be a specialty pharmacy?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that question, or you're passing that question off for somebody else, Jen, because I had somebody ask me that question. A group of students asked me that yesterday. There's not a special class of trade from state board perspectives to recognize you as a specialty pharmacy. Oftentimes, you're looking at it as a retail-based or a community-based type of practice, a hospital-based type of practice, and mail order. There's not a special class of trade from a licensing perspective as it relates to specialty. And so oftentimes, state by state, it may teeter between a community-based license or a mail order based license, just for recognition from a state board to be able to dispense. Now, you have to follow the same criteria as you would from a non-resident perspective. You know, if I'm here in Pittsburgh and I want to ship to Jen's office in Virginia, you know, I would need to have a non-resident license for the state of Virginia, in addition to my in-state license for where my pharmacy resides. So, you know, there's those types of considerations to take into play, but oftentimes it's really variable state by state, and it tends to teeter between those types of designations. Now, from a payer perspective, you may be offered different types of contracts along those same lines. You might be reimbursed under a retail contract, and so you dispense certain NDCs or a certain volume or a certain proximity outside of where your contract resides, and they may look to offer you a different type of contract to be able to be reimbursed. But that's really up to the individual payer. Some of them may put restrictions on your contracts to say, okay, you need to have a specialty taxonomy on your NPI number in order to be able to dispense these drugs. And those are all things that are, again, it's largely variable because there's not a true standard out there to manage these things. I think a lot of that is because there's not a hard and fast sort of definition as far as what specialty really looks like either.
Yeah, there's more questions than answers always for those types of questions. It's so variable. I think you put it together, summarized it nicely. With the low margins on specialty medication, is there a threshold, like sales amount, that's known as a benchmark, where after the DRI fees, it's a profitable business to do? Like, what would your break even or start to profit number be?
You know, it's that's a really good question. You know, from a specialty perspective, you know, the margins tend to be lower. I mean, I read recently that average margins could be anywhere between like 2 and 6%. Now, 2 and 6% of a higher cost product, you know, a little bit of a lot still is a little bit more than what you might see out of other revenue models. But you know, taking that lower margin from a reimbursement perspective, partnering that with the higher cost to dispense, you know, it's hard to say if there's any real one break-even point where that may make sense, because in particular, you know, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, you may be able to compound your internal margins, your overall like EBITDA, as it relates to a number of different avenues. You know, you're not just looking at dispensing and cost to dispense. You might have additional revenue streams through products and services or counseling or data or things like that that can help to offset those margins. And so, you know, I generally recommend that if you can find ways to marry your dispensing revenues with something to help to augment that, it takes and it offsets what that 2 to 6% margin might be and brings it to a more favorable sort of outcome. So I don't necessarily know if there is a threshold. It really it becomes a level of tolerance for each individual pharmacy to say, you know, where do we feel comfortable with this? How much do we need to reinvest in providing the scope and the services that our pharmacy needs to provide to continue to manage these specialty patients and become profitable thereafter? So it really becomes, you know, an individual cut point as far as what that level of tolerance is for investment versus profit for most pharmacies.
Thanks. And I have, I think, just one last question. So if you still have a question for Jonathan, make sure you enter it now while we answer this last one. We brought up DIR fees. You knew this question was coming to you. Any words of advice on DIR fees?
You know, take a deep breath and weather the storm. I think would be my best recommendation. Yeah, DIR has really had a huge impact on every segment of care as it relates to the pharmacy industry. And I know that there are a number of things that are being done, particularly with you know, drug reform and drug pricing reform as a component of what's going on from a legislative perspective right now, where DIR fees may hopefully be something in the past as we go. But you know, it's one of those areas from a specialty perspective where you may get to be engaged in that just due to more augmentative care as opposed to the direct care associated with specialty drugs. So by the nature of DIR fees, they don't necessarily hit a lot of the diagnostic classes that you would see from a true specialty perspective. Where you may start to have issues with the DIR fees is if you, as a specialty pharmacy, may look to provide supportive care. Maybe it becomes a viable business model for you to not just fill their specialty drug, but let's dispense supportive therapies along with that. A lot of times we see that in HIV populations. Yes, you're dispensing their antiretroviral drugs, but their antiretroviral might be causing their lipids to spike. You might be giving them a prophylactic antibiotic. You might start to see DIR is more associated with those therapies that would be under a more traditional sense than the specialty sense. And so, it's probably best just to know that they're there, keep tabs on where you are trending and where you're looking to manage things. And, from that perspective, if you're looking at it as a true specialty consideration, DIR doesn't, if you're a true pure play specialty, you may not have as much of an impact, but it is definitely something to be cognizant of, because it can continue to cut in on those margins, and it's not something that you recognize right away. It's that letter you get 3 months later and the direct deposit back out of your account that tends to impact you from there.
Well, that was our last question for today. So many thanks to AcceleraRx for their generous sponsorship, and to Jonathan for sharing his knowledge with us. As a quick reminder, in order to get CE, please follow the link in the follow-up email to take the short quiz within 24 hours. On deck for the summer series on July 8th is practical tips for managing long-term home parenteral and enteral nutrition patients. This is a must-see webinar for all providers managing nutritional patients. Don't forget to purchase NHIA's Industry Trends Report. This is an industry-defining report. Is a guide to understanding the home and specialty infusion market, and outline key metrics on how the industry has evolved over the last decade. This report, the first since 2010, connects 227 data points and tells the story of our industry. This new data provides valuable business intelligence into the industry's current state. That's a must-have for anyone in home infusion. Thank you to all of our providers and suppliers who are working on the front lines to keep patients safely in their home. We are looking forward to bringing you more education each week during NHIA's summer series. Enjoy the holiday. Thank you.